Something shifted that day, not loudly, not in a way anyone else could clearly point to. They said something casual on the surface. They did something small enough to deny later. But it crossed a line that had been bending for a long time. And instead of reacting, instead of defending yourself the way they expected, you went quiet. That was the moment. You didn't explode, you didn't argue, you just observed the tone, the timing, the pattern. Suddenly everything made sense in a way it hadn't before. This wasn't new. It was confirmation. They mistook your silence for hesitation, for confusion, for weakness. It wasn't, it was assessment. Because when you stopped speaking, you started seeing the interruptions, the subtle disrespect, the tests disguised as jokes, the way they measured you when they thought you weren't looking. And whether they admit it or not, they can feel something changing. You haven't announced it, you haven't confronted them, but your energy isn't reaching the same way anymore. Your responses are shorter. Your presence is different. This wasn't the first offense, it was just the first time you understood it clearly. And once you see it clearly, you can't go back to being unaware. You never wanted war. You were never the reckless one, never the loudest in the room. You valued depth over attention, loyalty over popularity, peace over pointless dominance. You believed that if you moved with integrity, if you stayed solid, things would remain steady. But calm people are often misunderstood. They looked at your restraint and saw fragility. They mistook your patience for passivity, your silence for insecurity. They assumed that because you didn't react instantly, you wouldn't react at all. Worse, they believed you couldn't. That was their first mistake they provoke. You calculate. While they chase emotional victories in the moment, you study patterns over time. You don't respond to a single comment. You track consistency. You don't explode over one incident. You analyze the sequence. Tone shifts, subtle disrespect, repeated boundary testing disguised as humor. You saw it accumulating long before they realized you were paying attention. Because the truth is, the war didn't begin during the confrontation. It didn't start when voices rose or lines were crossed publicly. It began the moment they underestimated you. The moment they decided you were safe to test, easy to dismiss, unlikely to shift. But you were shifting not into chaos, into awareness. And once awareness settles in, everything changes. You stop trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop offering loyalty where there is quiet competition. You never wanted war, but you recognized it when it arrived. It wasn't just one moment. It was the accumulation, the subtle mockery masked as humor, the way you were spoken over when your insight went too deep, the invitations that stopped coming, the decisions made without you, the shift in tone when you entered the room, the quiet replacement, the manipulation wrapped in concern. You felt it before you proved it. And that's what made it heavier. Betrayal doesn't always arrive as an explosion. Sometimes it's a pattern that slowly reveals you were standing alone long before you realized it. You replayed conversations in your head, questioned your perception, wondered if you were overthinking. You weren't. There was a moment, small but irreversible, when something inside you split. The old you wanted to preserve the connection, to give the benefit of the doubt, to explain it away. The new you stepped back and observed without emotion. That was the fracture, not a breakdown. A division. In that space, innocence died. Not your kindness, not your depth, just the naive belief that everyone valued what you valued. You stopped assuming alignment. You started verifying it. Most people go back. You didn't. Most people feel the sting and rush to repair it, even if it costs them self-respect. You didn't beg for clarity. You didn't chase reassurance. You went inward, and that's where the real war began. It wasn't loud. There were no dramatic exits, no public declarations, just sleepless recalibration, quiet pattern recognition, emotional detachment forming layer by layer. You began noticing who interrupts, who competes, who subtly celebrates your setbacks. Who grows distant when you grow stronger. You stopped reacting to words. You started responding to patterns. And once that shift happens, there's no returning to who you were before it. The real conflict wasn't with them. It was inside you. One part of you wanted to forgive instantly, to smooth it over, to preserve the history. That part remembered the good moments, the shared laughter, the version of them you believed in. It whispered that maybe you were overanalyzing. Maybe it wasn't intentional. But another part of you had started taking notes. Precisely. It didn't argue. It observed, it tracked tone shifts, micro-expressions, delayed responses, backhanded compliments disguised as support, inconsistencies between words and behavior. Your nervous system sharpened before your logic caught up. You felt the misalignment in your body before you articulated it in your mind. That's when you realized something irreversible. You're operating from somewhere deeper now. Not more paranoid, more perceptive, not colder. Clearer, the old you moved from assumption. The new you moves from evidence. The old you extended trust automatically. The new you understands that access is earned. They think the conflict is between you and them. They think it's about a disagreement, a misunderstanding, a single incident that can be resolved with a conversation. But the real war? It's between who you were and who you're becoming. Between comfort and clarity, between attachment and alignment, between being liked and being respected. And clarity is uncomfortable. It forces you to admit that some connections were built on your tolerance, not their loyalty. It forces you to see that peace maintained at your expense was never peace. This internal war doesn't make you louder, it makes you sharper. Because once the new version of you wakes up, it doesn't go back to sleep. While they focused on winning moments, you focused on mastering momentum. They chased ego victories, subtle digs, social positioning, performing strength in public, every move reactive, every tactic visible. Checkers on a small board, thinking 3 steps ahead was impressive. You stepped back and studied the entire pattern. Instead of arguing, you built discipline, physical discipline that stabilized your body. Emotional regulation that slowed your reactions. Silence that made people reveal more than they intended. You trained yourself not to respond instantly, not to give away information freely, not to explain your intentions to those committed to misunderstanding them. You stopped explaining yourself, stopped defending, stopped reacting publicly, and that silence unsettled them. Because when you no longer rush to correct narratives, people are forced to sit with their assumptions. When you stop volunteering access to your thoughts, they realize how much they depended on reading you. They can feel something changing. You're not as available, not as transparent, not as easily provoked. People sense when access is restricted. They feel it in the pauses, in the shorter replies, in the way you no longer overextend to maintain comfort. You still show up, but differently, observant. Unexposed, controlled distance is power. It gives you perspective. It reveals who reaches out with sincerity and who reaches out for control. It exposes who respected you and who only enjoyed your openness because it made you predictable. You became harder to read, harder to trigger, not louder, more precise. Your words carry weight because there are fewer of them. Your reactions are calculated because they are no longer emotional reflexes. You don't move from wounded pride, you move from informed awareness. This is where pain becomes leverage. Every slight sharpened your perception. Every betrayal refined your standards. Every moment of exclusion forced you to become self-contained. They thought they were pressuring you. They were training you. And now the board looks different from where you stand. You didn't seek revenge, that's what confuses them. They expected retaliation, a public correction, a sharp response. Something loud enough to match the tension they created. They prepared for conflict, for confrontation, for chaos. What they got was absence, and absence is heavier than chaos. You didn't destroy them socially. You didn't attack their name. You didn't try to win a crowd. You buried something far more significant. Their access, their influence, their psychological reach into your inner world. The funeral wasn't for them. It was for the parts of you that tolerated what should have been rejected. Old emotional triggers. Gone the need for validation. Buried. Explaining yourself finished. You stopped rehearsing arguments in your head. Stopped imagining speeches you would never give. Stopped trying to make them see what they refused to acknowledge. You realized clarity doesn't require their agreement. Real power is emotional non-availability. It's the ability to witness provocation without feeling compelled to respond. It's the discipline to let silence communicate what anger once tried to express. It's understanding that not every battle deserves your presence. They can sense the shift, even if they can't articulate it. This version of you is harder to access. You don't overshare. You don't overreact. You don't chase closure from people who benefited from your confusion. Your energy is no longer something they can tap into whenever they feel insecure or bored or threatened. You became untouchable not because you built walls, but because you built standards. Untouchable because your nervous system no longer spikes at their tone. Untouchable because you no longer interpret distance as rejection. Untouchable because you don't need to be understood to remain steady. They thought the war would escalate. Instead, it ended quietly. Not with destruction, with detachment. And detachment, when it's chosen consciously, is the highest form of control. Most people retaliate impulsively. They fire back the moment they feel disrespected. They raise their voice to match the volume of the room. They try to win loudly so no one questions their strength. For a moment, it feels powerful, immediate, satisfying, but it's temporary. Most people spiral. They obsess over being understood. They argue with people committed to misunderstanding them. They chase closure from the very source of their confusion. They call it standing up for themselves. You chose something harder. You refined quietly. While they reacted outwardly, you recalibrated inwardly. While they tried to control perception, you strengthened position. They started the war, emotionally reactive, driven by impulse, unaware of consequence. You finished the funeral, psychologically evolved, composed, irreversible. That path is rare because it requires self-confrontation. Sitting alone with uncomfortable truths. Admitting where you ignored red flags. Acknowledging where you overextended. Facing the parts of yourself that tolerated less than you deserved. It demands isolation, training, discipline. Journaling through confusion instead of projecting it. Therapy if necessary. Brutal self-awareness when it would be easier to blame. Not everyone survives their own shadow. Some people avoid it their entire lives. They drown it out with noise, relationships, distractions, constant validation. They never sit still long enough to meet the darker parts of themselves. The insecurity, the fear of abandonment, the need to be chosen. You did. You faced the insecurity and strengthened it into independence. You faced the fear and turned it into discernment. You faced the need for validation and replaced it with self-trust. That's why this evolution feels different. It isn't performative, it's earned. And when growth is earned in silence, it doesn't need applause to be real. There are rules you live by now, not rules you post. Not rules you preach, rules you embody. You don't announce moves, you let results introduce you. Silence has become part of your strategy, not because you're hiding, but because you understand that premature exposure weakens position. You don't argue with perception. If someone insists on misunderstanding you, you let them. Clarifying yourself repeatedly is a form of seeking approval. You no longer negotiate your identity for comfort. You observe inconsistencies. Words matter less than patterns. Promises mean little without behavior. You trust alignment, not intensity. You remove access without drama. No speeches. No ultimatums, just adjustment. Energy is applied. Presence withdrawn. You respond once, then reposition permanently. This isn't coldness. It's calibration. You've learned that constant tolerance breeds quiet resentment, that over-explaining invites manipulation, that emotional availability without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. So you adjusted. War didn't harden you. It clarified you. It showed you where you were too open, where you confused empathy with obligation, where you stayed longer than alignment required. Now your standards are sharper, but your heart is still intact, just protected by discernment. And even this version of you isn't final. This isn't your final form. You're still refining, still sharpening, still evolving beyond reactions, beyond ego, beyond the need to prove. The difference now is that your growth is intentional, directed, and no longer dependent on who stays or who leaves. They thought it was a fight, a clash of egos, a temporary storm, something that would flare up, burn hot, and fade back into normal. They prepared for resistance, for arguments, for visible damage. They didn't realize it was a transformation ritual. Pressure revealed what comfort concealed. Conflict exposed what peace had been hiding. What they interpreted as tension was actually initiation. You weren't defending yourself. You were shedding skin. They expected noise. You delivered inevitability. No dramatic exit. No chaotic unraveling. Just a gradual shift in posture, in access, in energy. You became less available to nonsense, less reactive to provocation, less interested in proving anything to anyone. You don't celebrate the funeral. You don't visit the grave. You don't replay what happened or fantasize about redemption arcs. You don't need apologies to validate your clarity. Once something is buried, you let it remain buried. And then you move forward. That's what unsettles them the most. Not anger, not retaliation, but composure. The quiet understanding that something irreversible has occurred. They started something they didn't understand. You ended something they can't recover from. Not their reputation, not their comfort. Your old self, the version that tolerated misalignment, the version that ignored intuition, the version that confused patience with self-sacrifice. That version is gone. What remains is steady, observant, grounded, not aggressive, not loud, just evolved.